Hello, everybody, and welcome to Anglepoint's webinar on managing the transition to Autodesk named user licensing. I am really excited to see so many of you join us for what will be a practical and informative session, and also a hello to everyone who will listen to this recording afterwards. This webinar is intended for anyone interested in Autodesk licensing, including those who haven't yet transitioned, who have a hybrid model, and those who have already transitioned and want to get a deeper understanding of the impact and the steps needed to maintain compliance and optimize your Autodesk estate. The agenda today, we will have a short introduction to our presenters and to Anglepoint, a high-level history of Autodesk to understand why and how they operate. Then we will move on to what the transition to named user licensing looks like and our recommended best practice approach to manage that transition. At the end, as Braden mentioned, we will open up for Q&A. So if you think of any questions throughout the session, feel free to pop it into the chat and we can go through those at the end. Okay, introductions. Craig, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure can. Thanks so much, Sarah. So Craig van der Velden here. I'm a vice president with Anglepoint, lead our SAM service delivery team. So that's made up of our tier 1 client management, our SAM maturity program design, audit defense, as well as our software development team. That's a lot of words, but really what that means is our SAM service delivery team looks to ensure the clients are partnered with a trusted advisor that helps them in baselining, preparing, and improving their overall SAM program.
Great, thanks, Craig. Hi, my name is Sarah Marriott, and I am the Specialty Licensing Manager at Anglepoint. I've worked in the IT industry for over 9 years across many different functions, including in finance, procurement, sales, operations, and in technology departments themselves. So purchasing, budgeting, consuming, and creating the software across various industries before now being part of SAM. So my responsibility at Anglepoint is leading our specialty licensing practice, which includes tier 2 and 3 vendors, such as VMware, Micro Focus, Dassault, and of course, Autodesk. So a little bit about our specialty licensing practice. We are a global team of subject matter experts who have experience across more than 85 different publishers. And while we find that many organizations are familiar with some of our core publishers like IBM, Microsoft, SAP, and Oracle, other software vendors can require a specialized set of skills and knowledge to effectively manage your estate. And these types of skills are not often found in internal SAM teams. Often, specialty licensing software is business critical. So if you think of Autodesk or other engineering applications, engineering companies need these applications to be running smoothly in order to function. If they can't access the software, then it can be incredibly expensive to have thousands of engineers not being able to work. My team understand the intricacies of these specialty vendors and partner with our clients to deliver actionable insights to help optimize your estate. And given that companies can have more than 200 different vendors on their books, we can also support in prioritizing these so you can get your best return on investment. So that's just a little bit about us. I'll pass on to Craig to talk about Anglepoint.
Thanks, Sarah. So Anglepoint is an organization we just crossed our 10th or 11th year in business. Anglepoint is a IT asset management, software asset management consulting firm. And what we look to do is really drive cost optimization, risk mitigation of everything relating to your software assets. So that is both the baselining and understanding of both your entitlements, your contract position, your overall effective license position. And one of the most critical parts of that, of course, is the deployment and usage of the software. We operate globally in approximately 14 to 15 markets and have quite a large number of the top Fortune 500 companies that are working with us in some capacity today. Wonderful, thank you. Gartner last year, for those who are more familiar in the software asset management industry, will be aware that Gartner released a Magic Quadrant last year for SAM managed services, and we're very pleased to say that we are one of the leaders in that Magic Quadrant that is seen and recognized to be industry leading, as well as a real driver for the software asset management industry, aligned with the ISO standards, of which our President and Chairman Ron Brill is currently on the board for. If you do want any further information, Braden will place a link to all the attendees in the chat if you do want to download that report and get any additional information about Anglepoint or indeed the Magic Quadrant.
Great, thanks so much, Craig. Okay, so let's get into it. So, history of Autodesk. Autodesk was founded in 1982 with just $59,000 and 6 developers, including John Walker and Michael Riddle. It started with John buying AutoCAD from Michael, and then they built on top of the software. At the time, AutoCAD was niche and was released when many PCs didn't even have mice. And it might seem strange to us now, but indeed, AutoCAD was one of the first that could draw perfect circles with just a command. It's also interesting to note that 4 of the other co-founders were European. So from day one, sales were coming from Europe, the UK, and the US. By nature, AutoCAD is an expensive product, and Autodesk was the first company to sell 1,000 copies of $1,000 software totaling over $1 million. John was the CEO and made an interesting decision to have management positions filled by developers who had that deep technical understanding of the software, not just the people with, MBAs. They were firmly a PC software company who created CAD software, which was a big part of their selling point during the IPO in 1985. By 1989, Autodesk controlled over 60% of the market share for CAD software, which increased significantly. So that is an incredible feat. In 1992, Carol Bartz was named CEO. Bartz brought more of a business mindset to the organizations, and among many decisions, narrowed the focus to primarily the Windows platform and encouraged the company to fail and fail fast. Over her tenure of 14 years, she led the company from $300 million in revenue to over $1.5 billion. Autodesk leveraged their partner ecosystem heavily to get as many people involved and learning the product. For example, they had 750 training centers by 1994 that educated users in AutoCAD and other Autodesk software. Once they'd learned it, then they wanted to buy it. So it created a community of educators, dealers, developers, and authors, which became crucial to Autodesk's support and influence in the market. They depended on a network of dealers, distributors, and direct sales to disseminate its products, and devised a system of cooperation with third-party software developers. This was called AutoCAD Development System and was devised in 1990 and structured to encourage independent software developers to create add-ons for Autodesk products. By 1994, over 2,000 independent developers were working to create specialized applications using Autodesk programs. Autodesk has been on a journey to become a fully SaaS company since 2001, when their subscription service first debuted. This is in line with many other software vendors, and so this is not a quick transition period as we look to the topic of today's webinar. In 2006, Carol stepped down and named Carl Bass as her replacement. He pursued a heavy acquisition strategy, and overall, since 1992 to now, Autodesk has acquired 56 businesses. Of interest, these businesses have been successfully integrated into the organization and include Revit, Sofdesk, and more recently in 2018, acquired Building Connected and PlanGrid, together worth $1.15 billion as Autodesk moves more into the construction industry. In 2016, Autodesk announced that perpetual licenses would no longer be sold. And then in 2017, there was a new CEO, Andrew Agonost, who during his first Investor Day announced a strategy to complete the transition to subscription by 2020. He also said that the last day to purchase new perpetual licenses would be January 31. And while this was the announcement, some organizations have since been able to buy perpetual licenses. During that Investor Day, Autodesk also shared their targets for the next 3 years. The original target set for total subscriptions was 5.4 million users. However, in 2020, Autodesk reported 4.9 million subscription users, and it's certainly something that they plan to ramp up in the coming years. In last year's investor presentation, the CEO declared that the transition was over. As part of this, they announced the end of support for perpetual licenses and multi-user subscriptions in 2021 to consolidate into named user licenses. To support customers, they promoted a number of trade-in options available during this transition, which we will go through a little later on. Of particular note during the keynote presentation is that the first source of revenue growth mentioned was monetizing non-compliant and legacy users. This was followed by accelerating digitization in the architecture, engineering, and construction, and convergence of design and make in manufacturing. Further in the presentation, it mentions the audit revenue stream as hardening systems and pushing the transition to named user to deepen their understanding and targeting. So this is definitely something to be mindful of from an overall Autodesk business strategy perspective. While the trade-in offers are expiring and that support is no longer offered for perpetual licenses from May 7 this year, if you've not made the transition, now is the time to make an informed business decision about your strategy and your approach. And for those who have transitioned, it's important to make sure that your environment reflects that transition and is optimized. Regardless if you have or not, it is critical to make sure that you are maintaining compliance across your Autodesk estate, which we'll also talk about a little later on. Okay, so our best practice approach to manage the transition. First, we'll start with the understanding the previous license model. We'll then go into considering the new license model, making an informed business decision, including pros and cons and other things to keep in mind before moving to counting periodically and accurately, and then overall how to best manage your estate proactively, including some tips on maintaining compliance. So first, I will pass to Craig to talk about understanding the previous licensing model. Craig?
Great, thanks, Sarah. So for those of us who have a history with Autodesk, we're probably fairly familiar with the standalone license model, which was originally debuted with physical hard lock keys. These were physical USB keys that were inserted into devices that licensed the software. As Autodesk migrated through their maturity in terms of licensing, they deployed an underlying FlexLM technology to run on network servers. So this is a multi-seat license that would sit on a server. And as the user would open the product, it would pull that license down off the server. And when they close the product, the license would load back up to the server and could be used then by somebody else. Shortly after the introduction of network licenses, Autodesk also moved into a multi-year subscription and multi-user subscription model. So what this model was and how that differed from the network licenses was really around it becoming more user-based. And as Sarah mentioned, as the different CEOs within Autodesk moved, the strategy changed from moving from a device-assigned license to the server-based license, which would still be then deployed down to devices. This was their first step in moving to a user-based model, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we're getting into the new models. For the majority of people out there today within the audience, you'll have likely a set of standalone licenses still entitled to be used within your organization for set versions of the Autodesk products. It is more common, though, within larger organizations to have a smaller set of standalone licenses used primarily for users who are outside of the office, on site, or in joint venture buildings. And the use of network licenses are for the more ad hoc user. So the user who may be a project administrator for a particular engineering product, someone doing a QA or a test of effectiveness on a particular model that's been designed within AutoCAD, or within indeed any of the other products. So we'll talk a little bit now about the new licensing strategy. So as Sarah mentioned, Autodesk is moving to a new model that's focused primarily on user base and subscription base in a named user sense. So Autodesk have a target currently to get around about 2 million in subscriptions annually. What that means is really that the push to move to the new user based licensing is going to be quite hard, and they've obviously had a very strict deadline of the termination of support on those previous license entitlements that you may have. Now, how they've also gone about doing this is to release what they're calling product collections. These are really bundles and support models. So these bundles that occur are designed with the idea that a typical engineer, depending on which department they sit in, will use very similar products. An engineer may use AutoCAD and also Revit, depending on which particular engineering sector that they're in. And so what Autodesk have done is created these collections, or otherwise called bundles, where it's cheaper then to purchase those individual software applications as a collection, as opposed to individually buying the actual applications. Now, these are bundled, again, per industry. So you'll have bundles of architecture, engineering, construction, product design, manufacturing, and media and entertainment. From a license perspective, we look at it from a component and bundle perspective, and a cost-saving opportunity. So really what that comes down to is understanding the profile of your end user, understanding what applications that they do need access to, and then ensuring that they are not over-licensed by giving them bundles that they're not going to use, but also ensuring that they're not under-licensed or ineffectively licensed by individually buying those products and then assigning them to a user. There are new and different Autodesk subscription plans that impact the level of support, the reporting, and the access rights in the new model. This is something that each organization really should stop and think about their strategy and what level of support they're looking for from Autodesk. This is commonly something that should be done in collaboration with individual areas of the business. Anyone who has worked within engineering teams and with engineers will know that it is very common for them to want additional support from a particular publisher or from colleagues, etc. And understanding what that support profile looks like can really play into how you then look to move to these new models. So just to talk about those quickly, the standard model is usually something where it's typical support. It is included a small number of hours in the contract, or it's purchased ad hoc. And this has really an aggregate level of reporting only. So it doesn't have the granularity that you would typically expect to see in a named user or a flex type of model, where you, in order to make real cost savings, you would want to see the aggregate level of who is using what, how are they consuming the software, to make the most informed decision about how to move them to the new model. The second subscription model that is offered is a premium subscription. This is what most large organizations will take, and it is reporting on a per user basis. So that gives you the granularity of exactly which users are accessing the software, how often are they accessing the software, what modules of the software that they're using. There's a third model on top of that for Autodesk's enterprise and key account customers. So this is usually for large engineering or construction firms, and it includes a lot of customization options. So being able to put in metadata like department, to be able to get better granularity into which departments are using which areas of their product set. There's also areas to be able to give additional admin rights called secondary admins that we'll talk about in a little bit later on today. What that secondary user is usually a champion from within the business or within the product line who can then assign and move around those licenses. The fourth and final option there is their education offering. The education offering is a typical education license like you would find for many of the other software out there. It's for authorized students from a qualified educational institution. Autodesk will require that student provide evidence that they are indeed going through a course or studying to be able to get access to that software. But it's something to keep in mind specifically, as it's quite difficult to understand from an estate perspective as you're looking at different reports, which licenses are educational and which licenses are not. So for engineering firms who have interns or analysts that may be using their own device, keeping an eye out for those education-based licenses is something that is core to Autodesk's audit strategy. Now, as Sarah mentioned earlier, this move from a perpetual license model to a fully subscription-based model, the key differences here is on the previous system, you had access to use those licenses in perpetuity forever. What they're doing now to force this change is to stop support and stop upgrades on those previous licenses, so that you would be able to historically always have the latest version of the software as long as your maintenance was paid. In the new subscription model, though, more of that flexibility is removed from the end user and is held more by Autodesk. So all rights to use the software ends when your subscription ends, whether that be that it's not renewed, not paid on time, etc. So this transition really focuses from the move from network and standalone licenses that were, again, more of a device-assigned license to a user-based subscription. So let's talk a little bit about what is that user subscription. So this is determined per an email address with a subscription account set up for the software. So the user has to have an Autodesk account and it's managed on their email address. It does not matter really how often they need access to it. It's just every user needs to have an account, and that's how Autodesk can monitor the license assignment. When we think about how that transitions, though, if we think about a scenario where on a network server on the previous license model, you may have had 100 users sharing 60 licenses because not every user needed to use the software at the same time. Moving forward, that will now need to transition to 100 licenses, one for each of those users. Now, under the terms, it does permit the use of backup installations. So that's an installation of and use of up to 3 devices, but only one being used at any one time. And that'll be something that primarily Autodesk will look for as part of any soft or hard audits, will be where users are potentially running that software on multiple devices at the same time. Now, finally, with the model, previously, it was all down to one administrator to administer how those licenses could be assigned out to the end users if they were standalone, or managed through complicated options files on the servers. Within the move to the subscription model, it now enables a secondary admin. So this is there can be multiple secondary admins that can then go and allocate the licenses. So it's moving in line with how most engineers are looking to see their licensing, where they have more control over it themselves. They can assign the software out to individual people within the business themselves without having to go through a fulfillment process or go through procurement or IT in order to get those licenses. This is also quite an easy way to reduce the workload on that primary administrator, because there is still only one primary administrator into the platform. It should also just be noted that Autodesk are on the lookout for any generic logins, people having access, multiple people accessing one email account. So any scenarios where there may be a generic email address used by multiple people, that will be a flag during a compliance review for breaching the terms of this named user. Now, finally, under that enterprise business agreement that premium tier of support that I mentioned, there is an option called flex licensing, and this boils the use of applications down to tokens. So you can purchase a set number of tokens, and each time a user accesses any of the applications, it consumes tokens. You can prepay for a set number of tokens to be consumed in the particular year, and in the agreement, there's a price for any token that you consume over your allotment. So it's very important to keep an eye on your token consumption and ensure that you do not exceed that without a commercial discussion occurring with Autodesk. The rates for exceeding your token allocation are usually higher than it would be for you to then just repurchase or buy additional tokens before you get to that point of reaching your limit. Now, the number of tokens is not one for one, so depending on the application will depend on how many tokens it consumes. So some applications like Autodesk will consume a smaller number of tokens than an application such as Revit. So generally speaking, the higher the cost of the application, the more tokens that it will consume. If you have that enterprise business agreement, you can assign and give access to an unlimited number of users at a flexible daily rate for a 3-year term. Now, this also includes, for any of us who have worked with these products for some time, there's always a versioning challenge. So historically, the licenses would be versioned on current version, usually referred to as N for Nelly, and a set number of previous versions. So by standard, it's usually N-2 or N-3. So current version less 2 versions, current version less 3 versions. Within the move to the named user licensing, this is all taken care of as part of those token assignments as well. And this can be something that you negotiate what that defined number of previous versions are into your agreement with Autodesk as you migrate. Now, this is a great option for organizations who have a high number of users accessing licenses, whether it be frequently or infrequently, because you pay based on usage rather than number of people. So one of the most important things is to really understand what your estate and what your business needs are to decide whether you need to go for the token flex model or whether it is indeed better to go for the named user model. So if we take a quick example of that, if a user is actively accessing the application all of the time, that their sole job, 8 hours a day, is in Autodesk products, it may be more cost effective to assign them a named user license as opposed to using the flex model, and having the flex model more reserved for the users who are accessing the software less frequently. Now, cloud credits are also one other option, which is somewhat similar to the token flex model. It's a unit of measure for certain Autodesk consumption-based web services. So these cloud credits are based on performing discrete tasks like rendering or running a simulation, and the model's highly customizable. So if there are scenarios in the business where you will have particular client presentations, you'll be doing those functions very consistently, then there are ways to take advantage of cloud credits to reduce your overall spend with Autodesk further. Because of the structure of those cloud credits are so bespoke, however, it's important that if you define a certain repeatable task and set for the cloud credits, that you really monitor the usage of those credits very closely. Just as similarly to the tokens, there is a price if you exceed those credits. Autodesk will generally endeavor to notify users and teams of an anticipated excess usage, but that's not a guarantee that they make, and that comes down to your relationship with Autodesk. There will be a link that we'll place in the chat here that will just give a little bit more detail around how that is looked at from a subscription cloud perspective.
Okay.
So with that, I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Craig. Okay, so now we have an understanding of what's changing. Let's go through the timeline that is managing or navigating this change. So in February 2020, Autodesk announced that they were no longer selling 2 to 3 year multi-user subscriptions. In May last year, Autodesk launched the new subscription models that Craig mentioned and announced they were retiring plans based on serial numbers and putting the user at the center. In August last year, it was announced that the maintenance plans for perpetual licenses and those multi-user subscriptions would not be able to be renewed in 2021. They all had to be, it would then become the named user subscription licenses. For maintenance plans for the perpetual licenses, these end May 7 this year, and then the subscription for multi-users has been extended to August this year. And then we also have our trade-in offers timeline. So at the first renewal before May 7 this year, customers can trade in one multi-user subscription or one network maintenance seat for 2 named user licenses. And then customers can also trade in one standalone license under maintenance for one named user subscription. At the second renewal after May 7 this year, you can still have trade-in options. However, these are less desirable. So you will have one multi-user subscription or one network maintenance seat for one named user license. Autodesk have said that the pricing of an annual subscription is comparable to annual maintenance for perpetual licenses. However, this should be considered as part of your financial modeling to see if that's true for your organization, and we'll go through that in a moment. To add certainty around pricing, Autodesk have offered an ongoing discount until 2028 with set price increases. So at least there is visibility into that. For any perpetual licenses that are not under current maintenance that you would like to trade in for a subscription license, there aren't specified models. However, Autodesk does say that they can tailor something for you. So if this is something that you're interested, then it's best to reach out to them or to your reseller. So then if we move to making an informed business decision. So now we know what it was before, what the transition is, and what the timeline we are working towards. Now we've got to figure out how to make an informed business decision about what to do with all of that information. Essentially, there are 3 choices. You can fully move to a subscription model. You can choose to keep your perpetual licenses, or you can have a hybrid model as a combination of both. So now I'm going to go through some of the pros and cons of moving to a full subscription model. So starting with the pros. So first and foremost, it is simplified. So there's no need to locally manage and maintain license servers because it's now in the cloud managed by Autodesk. This is also easier when everyone's working remotely in the age of COVID. And as Craig mentioned, having that secondary admin who can assign and unassign licenses, it does make it simpler and easier to manage. It is also secure. Depending on corporate policies, users can update their software via their Autodesk account without needing to wait for deployment by the admin. But this is dependent on your policy, as I mentioned. However, while this isn't a pro, something on the topic of security is that it's important to note that no updates to your perpetual licenses will be available from May that you would typically get as part of paying for maintenance support. So while you are still allowed and permitted to use those perpetual licenses, even if they're not under maintenance, it may mean that any security issues that arise won't necessarily have a patch ready to go to resolve them. So something to keep in mind. Another pro is around visibility, and Craig mentioned a little bit about the reporting earlier. So all support levels have that aggregate reporting of how many people are using each product, the version, and overall frequency of use. However, what we would want, or what most organizations need as part of a named user model, is having access to more detailed reports which are available with the premium and enterprise level of support. And that goes into which individuals are using what and how often. These reports are available from the Autodesk console and can be exported. So that is a benefit compared to trying to calculate consumption in the networked model, which is a little bit more complex. With the enterprise support level, you can also add company-specific information like location or business area or other information to tailor it to your needs. So that is another big benefit if you are under that enterprise business agreement, and that helps you have visibility into who is using what. As a bit of a FYI, this reporting is not available for every product, though it is available for most products, including cloud products, cloud services, and some desktop products. Another pro is the availability. So any user who has been given access to a license can use it. There are no issues of people forgetting to log out and check the license back in, or waiting for a license to be available to get your job done. Also, in terms of availability, is that it can be used working from home. So in general, enterprise or server-based products and those that don't require activation are not eligible for home use. However, this is dependent on the agreement, but this is certainly something to be particularly mindful of at the moment with the shift to working from home. Looking into some of the cons or challenges of moving to the subscription model, the first one is around cost. Subscription licenses are expensive, and they should be modeled 3 to 10 years out to forecast the full impact to your bottom line. As these licenses are no longer in perpetuity, if you want to access the license, you need to pay for the ongoing subscription to use it, and you're effectively locked in for the term of the agreement. Your modeling also needs to take into account how often the users need to use the license. So even a trade-in offer of 1 network license to 2 named user licenses, it might be more expensive than your current ratio of number of users to network licenses, especially for organizations who have optimized a follow the sun model. Please note that if you do stay and have a renewal coming up between now and May 7, those maintenance costs have increased quite significantly. One other challenge is the access to old versions. So Craig mentioned earlier around back versioning, and while newer versions of Autodesk software is backwards compatible, being able to access the previous versions of the application is dependent on the agreed number, as he said, typically about 3 years. Many organizations need to access old versions of the software to test for backwards compatibility. So for example, let's take an aviation business. If there is an incident involving a 10-year-old plane, as part of the investigation, the specific version of the software used to design the plane will need to be tested. And the same could be said for cars, ships, or even robots. There's many different use cases for this. And organizations need to have access to these old versions to support the investigation. However, if you trade these in, then you will no longer have access to these very old versions of the software. So something to consider. Another item is that there is no alternative for purchasing new licenses. All new licenses must be purchased under the subscription model. So if you do anticipate growth in demand of Autodesk software usage in your organization, then you'll need to either be fully subscription-based or have a hybrid model. To be prepared, we advise to anticipate scrutiny. Autodesk announced in their Investor Day last year that the transition to subscription is complete, and the first long-term business driver is monetizing non-compliant and legacy users. The Investor Day overview cited 12 million non-compliant users, and Autodesk are known to have an aggressive audit program. And at the moment, we're currently supporting a number of clients who are being audited by Autodesk. So regardless of your strategy of how you want to manage your Autodesk estate, maintaining compliance must be a high priority for everyone. When we think about the hybrid model, you can, of course, choose to have this approach where you can keep the perpetual licenses that you need and trade in what can be moved to a subscription. You should consider any potential overhead costs of maintaining a hybrid model, including managing the network and the cloud estate and maintaining compliance across both. It's clear that Autodesk wants to transition everything to subscription. So of course you still have the rights to use your perpetual licenses forever, but you do need to take into consideration the risks that may come along with it. Another key part to making this decision is, of course, your business strategy, as there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And we recommend asking some questions to figure out exactly how your business is using it. So, for example, is the use of Autodesk software a growth area, or is it likely to be decommissioned? If there is anticipated growth, then you will have no option but to pursue either subscription, a license model, or maintaining a hybrid approach. Going through those pros and cons that we just mentioned and see how they applied to your business, including the need for continued access to those old versions as we just mentioned. And then there's, of course, alternate providers. Sometimes we find that organizations purchase multiple types of software that essentially perform the same function. While it can be expensive and a lengthy process, it is always possible to consider alternate providers. However, with Autodesk being so dominant in the CAD space and with expectations in the market, depending on your circumstances, this might not be feasible, but it's always something to be considered. And then once you have made a business decision, then it's time to open a conversation with Autodesk or with your reseller. Once you've got the nuts and bolts of what will be included and what you want to purchase, you also need to negotiate the terms of that contract. We encourage all of our clients to negotiate fair and balanced terms in their software vendor contracts, and we have a contract negotiation practice that specializes in this area. So now I'm going to pass back to Craig to talk about the importance of counting periodically and accurately. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Sarah. And I do see some questions coming through the Q&A here. So we will have a session toward the end of the webinar where we can address and talk through some of those details in a little bit more detail than we've covered here. So the count periodically and accurately section is really around determining what those entitlements are, both pre and post the transition. Identifying what that consumption is today and what it will be tomorrow after the transition. The ability to do that transition well and not have a negative business impact will really come down to how sophisticated and detailed that you can get in terms of identifying and modeling your consumption currently, but also your consumption under the new model. There are a few things that we can suggest to really think about in terms of how your Autodesk is being procured when you're looking to determine those entitlements. And some of those are things like ensuring that you understand if you're purchasing locally, globally, or a mix of both. Whether separate business units or separate group companies, whether that be subsidiaries or joint ventures, have right to the entitlements, have right to use that software. Whether it is purchased through a multitude of channels, be that potentially direct and via a reseller, Do you have really a way to keep a systematic way to keep track of what those entitlements are and the evidence to support them, and whether there is really a need for that enterprise business agreement. From a consumption perspective, we also encourage all of our customers that are currently going through this transition to really have a detailed look into your multi-user licenses, have a look at how those licenses are being used today, so that you have an idea, not only just in terms of your compliance position today, but more importantly, again, to model how this transition is going to affect the consumption rate. You want to identify things like peak usage during the day and identify those different users that may benefit more from a named user license as opposed to using a token flex or a cloud credit model. Autodesk do commonly run proprietary scripts during their more difficult audits, which will find a multitude of different information than may be possibly visible to you from a license server. This could be installations that from a business perspective you might be unaware of. It could be serial keys that you don't have a clear understanding or entitlement for. It could even be something as severe as a cracked license key. And even in a lot of cases when that is removed from the device, whether that be the program uninstalled, the license key uninstalled, it does leave behind key areas and key license files on the end user's device, which can and do get discovered by those scripts. So as you're looking to model out that usage, try to go back a period within your license server and within your usage to get as much information as you possibly can, so that if that audit does occur, if we, as Sarah mentioned, obviously moving to monetizing those non-compliance cases, that you really have an understanding of walking into that with your eyes fully open and fully informed about everything that may currently be in the estate or was previously in the estate. So those are some key areas, and we'll be more than happy to talk through some more detail about that individually after this session, if that is of help to anyone.
Great, thanks, Craig. All right, everyone, so we'll move into the last part of the content part of today's webinar, which is talking about managing your estate proactively. Managing your technical environment and overall software footprint is critical to your business success by identifying these cost savings and minimizing compliance risk as part of your SAM program. In relation to Autodesk and all other prioritized publishers in your business, completing health checks of entitlements and usage is not only beneficial, but necessary. As Craig just went through, creating these effective license positions is great, but we then need to use that information to then inform business decisions. It's important to understand the data, to overlay it with the business strategy and understand how the business is using the software. As part of our engagements, we also have a risk opportunity assessment report, which takes the detail from the ELP and has it as a high level, realistic and actionable steps to help optimize your environment. Some of the questions in terms of how to overlay your business strategy that we recommend you ask is, should a user have access to it? Why are they using it? Maybe they just need a viewer to see a drawing, but they're not actually drafting or designing it. Are those users who book out the license for a whole day actually using the tool all day, or is it idle most of the time? And it's also important to know, how does the use of the software relate to your business's bottom line? Is it key growth area needing investment, or is it something that will be tapered off? Answering these questions, in addition to leveraging the ELP and RAW, mean that you have a clear view of your current estate, what actions need to take place, and which licenses need to be purchased or decommissioned. It's very important, as we have talked about, to ensure that compliance is maintained across your estate. We know that Autodesk are an aggressive auditor, and monetizing non-compliance is in their strategy. So I'll just very briefly talk about some common items that Autodesk look for during an audit. So the first one that Craig mentioned is pirated software. So even in the early 90s, Autodesk had hardware locks or dongles to prevent unauthorized software usage, and some still exist today. Autodesk actively tracks illegitimate serial numbers, and there are many cracked software websites that exist. Sometimes, even when there are authorized license keys available, some users, for whatever reason, still decide to access pirated software. Regardless of the reason, it is very serious and needs to be investigated and resolved. By using unauthorized software, it's a breach of contract, and depending on the jurisdiction, can be considered a criminal and or civil act of copyright infringement, which in the US can be punishable with prison time and fines. So if you do have any concerns or questions around suspected unauthorized usage, might be time to reach out, and we would be more than happy to help you navigate, resolve the issue, and help with processes to prevent future infringements. As Craig mentioned, Autodesk have back versioning rules. The number does depend on your agreement, but typically 3 versions. This can be a challenge to track, but it is something that can and often gets checked during an audit. It is also quite common to have geographic restrictions applied for both the perpetual and the subscription-based agreements, which is often checked and reviewed as part of an audit. This is where use is permitted in the country of purchase only. While there are some global travel rights, there are specific rules around this particular use case. If you don't have a global agreement, then you need to make sure that you do have processes in place to enforce geographic restrictions per your agreement. So overall, as we've gone through today, managing your Autodesk licensing portfolio is not an easy task. Autodesk is a diverse publisher with many complexities in contracts, language, and licensing. This complexity, combined with Autodesk's focus on compliance, makes this a publisher to keep your eye on. And if you haven't checked in on your Autodesk portfolio, now would be the time to do so. It is critical to understand and proactively manage your transition, or not, to named user licensing model. We appreciate that most internal SAM teams don't have the exposure to many publisher audits and may not be familiar with the intricacies of Autodesk licensing in both the previous and the new model. Anglepoint's specialty licensing program has this expertise, and we're actively helping many customers optimize their Autodesk estate. We'll have our Q&A session now, but apart from that, if anything from today's presentation has resonated with you or has prompted any questions that we might not get to you today, or you might not want to ask in a public forum, please reach out to us and we will happily get back to you. Okay. Over to you, Braden.
All right, yes, thank you. Thanks for that presentation. That was fantastic. During the presentation, we had quite a few questions come in. So I'll go ahead and just start asking those, and then Craig and Sarah, you can give those answers. The first question is, will there be an Autodesk integration in the named user transition by the access management admin, or will it have to be managed at the Autodesk portal level by the primary admin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 2 answers to that. So with the premium, and the enterprise support model, you are able to integrate with ADFS or Active Directory to make sure that you have a single sign-on page. You can use company credentials to manage the access to that portal and the user's rights. That is only available, though, under the premium and enterprise options. So for the smaller options, it is solely managed in the portal by the primary and secondary users.
Great, thank you. Perfect. The next question that came through was, if at the time of renewal, older versions need to be retained, how are those included, or how to include them in a token flex environment?
Yeah, great question as well. So, so this really comes down to the contract terms individually within your master contract. So, as we mentioned, the N-2 or N-3 being current version, less previous versions. One thing to keep in mind at the point of renewal, and indeed at any contract negotiation or contract event point, is to revisit those numbers and ensure that you are providing the versions back to the business that they require, and that is negotiated in the contract. If that is in the master contract, then you will be granted the access to that particular serial key within the portal.
Great. And just kind of a follow-up to that one, and this is just double checking. We had a question asking if Token Flex is one of the new models or if it's also going to be replaced by the named user licenses.
Yes, exactly. So the named user model and the Token Flex model are the two going forward, along with the cloud credit as well.
Perfect. Thank you. We had a question come in that was, which support level has the extra territory rights?
Great. So as part of the retiring the multi-user access, it'll come down to a case-by-case or company-by-company negotiation. So there is a strategy today from Autodesk that the extra territory rights will expire and not be offered after August 7th, 2022. So still quite a while to leverage that. They haven't yet built a very firm replacement of those extra territory rights, specifically as it relates to the Token Flex model. But there are negotiations that are currently underway within Autodesk to define which levels of support will automatically grant extra territory rights.
All right, thank you. Here's another one that came through. It was, did you experience that anyone managed to create a global enterprise agreement without premium support?
That's a great question. So generally speaking, no. Mainly because generally when you get to the enterprise level, you are still faced with the business needing and wanting to have that additional premium support. It is a high revenue earner and also a high profitability earner for Autodesk, so they will always try to push that regardless of what agreement that you're going to. But generally speaking, once clients get to that EBA or the enterprise business agreement, it does include support, and that's generally driven not just from Autodesk, but also from the business areas as well.
Excellent, excellent. Sorry, we've had all questions coming through. So one more that we had was, can you give examples of typical non-compliance scenarios?
Absolutely. So a number of areas in a non-compliance focus will be changing with the transition. So historically, a lot of the non-compliance was around cracked or illegitimate license keys, because that is something that can be controlled by the end user on their device if they know how. Secondly is the allocation of licenses or the checking out of licenses. There is a flaw currently in the technology that is running the network license servers, where you can effectively double consume. It's not a common practice, it's not commonly found, and it does require some steps to be taken by the IT administrator to do that. But it can be something that unknowingly has been enabled, and the license is then being consumed, the same license being consumed by two users at the one time. Other areas as we move into the named user model around non-compliance will be a heavy focus on the allocation to an actual person as opposed to a shared mailbox or shared license, or even with a shared PC, where it can be the software being installed on that PC that's actually licensed to a user and someone else just happens to be using that PC for the day.
Perfect, thank you. So we've hit the top of the hour. That's the end of our time that we have. If we didn't get to your questions, we will reach out to you personally and make sure to answer those for you. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to us You can reach out to info@anglepoint.com or on our website, anglepoint.com/schedule, if you'd like to schedule to meet with us. Or you can reach out to Craig or Sarah personally. There's their contact information there. So a huge thank you to everyone who attended. Thanks to Sarah and Craig. Do either of you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Just thank you to everyone for joining. We appreciate you taking the time. We hope you found this helpful, and please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you through this transition and making sure that your estate is optimized and within compliance.
Great. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you. Have a great day.